Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Klobus, and today I'm speaking with Raghuram, Rajan, and Rohit Lamba, authors of the book Breaking the Mold, India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity. Rohit, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be on our podcast. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourselves.
Rohit?
I'm an assistant professor currently at the New York University, Abu Dhabi, and I'm going to start as an assistant professor in the fall at Cornell University. So I'm an economist. I work in various aspects of theoretical economics, especially game theory. I also have an interest in economic policy, especially on stuff in India. I have worked with my very esteemed co-author, Professor Rajan, in various capacities in his office when he was the chief economic advisor and writing various op-eds, and very excited to present this joint book that we've written.
Yeah, this is Raghu. I have been a professor at the University of Chicago since 1991, with a couple of breaks to go out into the real world. I was the chief economist at the IMF for a while, and then I went to India, first, as Rohit said, as chief economic advisor, then as governor of the central bank. And, basically I am a applied theorist with a tremendous amount of empirical work. So the kind of theory I write is the kind that Rohit would laugh at, but it's trying to explain the world.
So what led the two of you to collaborate upon this book, and why did you choose this particular subject?
Right? What?
Raghu and I met him in 2013 when, as we discussed, he was the chief economic advisor. I was still a PhD student, and then when I went back to finish my PhD, and Raghu went to Bombay to become the head of the central bank, and we kind of kept in touch on and off, and used to regularly talk. And whenever we would talk economic policy and issues related to India would always come up. It was clear to both of us that we're both very passionate about India's economic future. And, when COVID struck, we got talking more, and we actually talked to a wide variety of people with interests and knowledge in various aspects of policymaking in India and around the world. And then slowly we started converting that into op-eds in the Times of India. And eventually, Raghu had the idea that we should, kind of put this knowledge together in the form of a book, which I was very excited about because Raghu had already written many books before. So for me, it was a great learning experience to work with him on the book and to see how a book is shaped. And, there were certain things that we didn't really agree or had a different point of view about how the political economy path of India was shaping up. And we wanted to put our ideas across for the wider public.
Yeah, just to add to that, we were troubled by the direction India was taking, both economically as well as socio-politically. And we thought that in order to, beat a model, and there's a very well-defined model of the way India is going, you need a model. You need a separate vision which tells you how everything fits in. And so we have a very strong belief that India's right path is along the direction of being a liberal democracy, of including all its citizens, but focusing economically on a different path from the traditional exports-led, manufacturing-led growth path that every East Asian economy has followed. We think India has to do it differently because the world has changed, and it can do it differently. It has the capabilities to do so.
I want to focus upon that element that you just described, Raghu, which was why India needs to find a different path, because this is one of the reasons why I found your book such a fascinating read, because the two of you are addressing what to me is both one of the big questions of contemporary history and also one of the big questions, if not the big question, of the 21st century economy, which is, where is India going as an economy? And everyone, has this idea of comparing to China, which has this spectacular story, dating back to, the 1980s of rapid advancement into the economy that it is today. And how sometimes you see in commentary pointing to that model as that's what India should do. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a bit to start us off by why that model that China and some other Asian nations have adopted simply won't work today. Is it because of the differences in the global economy today? Is it differences between India and China? What are the dynamics which make that model unhelpful as a model for India?
Well, it's all of the above, right? It's start first with the fact that the world is not ready for another China. We've already seen a pushback against globalization, an increase in protectionism, an increase in tariffs, even specifically against China, but more generally across the world. And this is driven by the fact that countries have seen their manufacturing sectors succumb to the pressure of competition from China, but increasingly from other countries also. So the first recognition is the world is not as it was, say, in the 1980s and 1990s when China really took off. Today, it's much more aware of concerns about manufactured good imports. And there's what I would describe as manufacturing fetishism. We can't let go of our manufacturing sector, whatever remains of it. In fact, we have to try and bring it back, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, all these are words that you hear today. So that's one. The second is in Asia, the way this worked was the early movers in manufacturing went up the value chain. They left the low end and went up to the higher end to more skilled manufacturing. This was called the flying geese model, with Japan at the head and other Asian countries following. The problem is China is a really big country. And even though it is moving into more sophisticated industries and increasing the value added, it's not yet ready to leave the unskilled areas so far. So as India enters these areas, it's facing fierce competition from China, but also from other countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh. And that leads to the third point, which is that when China entered these areas, it was using its cheap labor as its competitive advantage against the labor from industrial countries. And so manufacturers were willing to forgive China for its relatively poor infrastructure, relatively poor contractual law, etc., because cheap labor offset all these disadvantages. Today, India, when it goes into these areas, is competing with a China or a Vietnam, which already has cheap labor, but also has built some of those advantages, such as good infrastructure and, contractual law is still work in progress, but it has come a long way from where they started with only cheap labor as an advantage. So, in other words, what we're saying is the environment has become politically difficult and economically very competitive to go the old route. India has to discover a new path, a path which works for the strengths that it has, rather than try competing on the playing field that others are already good at.
Just to quickly add to that, India, was unusual in its what economists call structural transformation, in that it, before its time, in some sense, developed a very big comparative advantage in high-skilled services. And actually, that has spilled over to various other, which is what we cover in the book, sectors of the economy, including manufacturing. So services, manufacturing itself has changed because it has a large component of services embedded in them. So when you buy, for example, a Tesla car, it has millions of lines of code written into it, which is an intermediate service embedded into the final manufactured good that you're consuming. So all these intermediate services India is very good at. It has also become very good at globalized services, which is in India called global capability centers. So, Walmart has its largest office outside the US in India, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Google is building its largest office outside the US in India. So there is this sort of, what we're suggesting is that there is a standard model. India has sidestepped that model in a different way, both politically and economically, because India became a democracy much earlier than all the East Asian economies. China still isn't. And so this political economy mixture that India has created is somewhat unique to it. And India should, in fact, double down on both these aspects of its political economy story, then kind of backtrack on them.
One way that I read your argument in the book was you were saying that India, in some respects, has the same basic asset that China does in terms of its people, and what you're saying in the book is that India needs to use that asset in a more 21st century fashion. What you focus upon in it is the idea that what India needs to develop is its human capital, its creativity, its ability to innovate. And the argument you make in the book is that is more important today. And this is building upon what the two of you have already said in the 21st century. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a bit more about how that has become more important than it was, say, a generation ago when, manual labor, itself was a sufficient driver, and why India in particular should put its hopes there.
Well, it's a little bit of what we've already discussed, in the sense that the low-skilled labor part of it has become much more competitive today. And the sort of additional monopoly part that used to exist there has been sort of competed away. And therefore, what is left, where there is much more value added, much more profits, is the creative side of it. The more service-oriented side. So an example probably will bring the point home. Think of the Apple iPhone, right? Much of the value added is in the early parts of the supply chain, when the creative processes are at work, designing that iPhone. We all know how Steve Jobs did a wonderful job, but also all the intellectual property that went into the patents that formed the iPhone. So a lot of content creation and design goes in initially into the product. Then the product, goes down the production chain to manufacturing. And, it may come as a surprise to some listeners, but Apple hasn't really manufactured anything since 2004. And much of the manufacturing of the iPhone takes place by Foxconn, which has factories in China, in Taiwan, and now increasingly in India. And this is the manufacturing part. And then the phone gets transported back to the markets where, a fantastic Apple store is where the product is sold. And then, Apple controls the content through the App Store, through, devices like iTunes, the marketing, the finance. This is, again, where it makes money. So Apple controls both ends of the supply chain, the initial product creation and design, and the final product distribution to the consumer. And it's worth about 60 times more at about $3 trillion than is worth Foxconn, and which is worth about $50 billion on a good day. So why this difference in value added? It's because value has migrated from the actual manufacturing to design. And you can see this in industry after industry. In chips, for example, even though TSMC, the Taiwan company which makes the actual chip, is worth quite a lot, around $500 billion. It is dwarfed by the value of NVIDIA, for example, which is over $2 trillion. NVIDIA doesn't, again, manufacture the chips. It designs them. So does Qualcomm, so does Broadcom. And the actual manufacturing accounts for a really small portion of the value chain. So what we're saying is, increasingly, there is an incentive to skip the low-skilled portion to go to the high-skilled portion, and that is requires a tremendous investment in education, in healthcare, in capability building.
Just to add to that quickly, at no point in time are we suggesting in the book or in this conversation that India shouldn't do any manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs will come to India, both low-skilled and high-skilled, but there are no free lunches. India is still a relatively poor country at $2,500 per dollar capita income. So it will matter what we prioritize, what the policy prioritizes, what the education system prioritizes, and so on. At the level of human capital, there is an easy there's an easy argument, which is that independent of whatever path India chooses, actually at the level of primary education, secondary education, vocational training, that needs to be done irrespective of what, whether policymakers buy our argument about a different structural transformation for India or not. Because at this point, the big gap between where China was at, let's say, $2,500 per capita dollars income and India is, the biggest gap actually is in the quality of our human capital. What is the size of the moderately skilled labor in the market?
And, just continuing on this theme, the mistakes that India has made, and I think the world is making today, is to pick certain industries and to say we're going to do really well here. That's not a given. And we should guard against being seen as people who are advocating services as the only way. What we're saying is increasingly, because of technological change, because of what happened during the pandemic, it's much more tolerable and easier to deliver services at a distance. This is an opportunity India should absolutely embrace and push further if it can. But by no means are we suggesting that, now government subsidies should shift from manufacturing to services. No, we're saying we need to do the homework to make sure that these opportunities can be seized by India. And that means working on multiple fronts, both in terms of expanding the quality of early childhood care and education, which India still lacks and lags behind on, but also recognize that the true value added in this new world, especially with the advent of AI and automation, will come from creativity. And that means having really good universities which are able to train our youths in to the best to get the best from them, and that requires a lot of investment. And this is where Rohit's point that we have limited resources as a country. We need to decide whether we're going to put massive subsidies in manufacturing, build chip foundries, or we're going to put them in higher education, build first-rate universities. And universities need money for the labs, for the faculty that they hire. And India has an opportunity of choosing one or the other. We're saying don't subsidize, focus on increasing the quality of human capital.
I'd like to take what you just said and ask you to expand upon it a bit, because what you recommend there is just one of several recommendations that the two of you make in this book as to how India can maximize the opportunities before it. As you identify, India already has a lot of strengths that some of the finest university graduates in the world, a very motivated workforce, innovation, but it could be doing more to build upon that. And you identify in particular three categories, one of which you describe, which is how they can improve human capital formation. But I want to, before we perhaps elaborate upon that, I want to get to the first one, which is how India can reform its government to better take advantage of this model that the two of you are setting out.
Right.
Yeah, so both in terms of public services, right, health and education, and in terms of kind of encouraging competitiveness and creativity, actually what is really lacking in India vis-a-vis some other countries, for example, China, is decentralization. And we really emphasize in the book. So what do we mean by that? A simple example to explain this is the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, which is the largest state, most populous state in India, is the fifth largest country in the world. Okay, so this has 250 million people. At the time of independence, India gave itself a very centralized government, which perhaps at the time made sense because both the ruling elite and the population in general was very scarred by what in India is called partition, which is the carving out of Pakistan out of India. And also the elites didn't really trust local administrators that they would not propagate existing hierarchies and discrimination in society. So India gave itself a very, very centralized form of government. Now that those fears of secessionism have basically subsided, and local authorities are more competent at the level of funds, functions, and functionaries. India needs to decentralize way more. Think of an average state or province in the United States, you have this, you obviously have the federal government, but you also have the state government, you have the municipal government, you have the city mayor. There's so many people, and a lot of these people also have the ability to raise taxes and so on. This structure is not very well developed in India. And what we diagnose is that one of the key problems for the kind of not very good performance in health and education is because governance is highly centralized. Even at the level of encouraging entrepreneurial talent and encouraging, for example, foreign firms to come to the country, the contrast we show is that, we argue in the book is that, when you go to China, you are met with local mayors who help you set up factories. Whereas in India, you will meet, for example, the central minister. Right? So even at the level of encouraging or helping business do business, governance in India is too centralized.
So one example of this public provision is what is happening in the Delhi government, which Delhi is like a huge mayoralty or a municipality. And, it was given its own government many years after independence. What you see happening in Delhi is much more of a focus on improving the quality of schools, improving the quality of local clinics that the government runs, the ties between the kid clinics and the Delhi hospitals. The Delhi government has really done wonders in the public provision of these services, so much so that today the results from Delhi government-run schools are matching the results from private schools, which is something unheard of in the rest of India. So why is that happening? Because the Delhi government can do things and people on the ground see it and they reward them. So they know the Delhi government is behind the repainting of the schools, ensuring that the schools sort of open, close on time, the teachers show up, the pharmacies in the clinics are open, have medicines. I mean, they can be held directly responsible because they're nearby, and that makes a huge difference. As Rohit was saying, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, if policies are set at the state capital and you are 300 miles away in some small village, who do you hold responsible when the teacher doesn't show up? Because the local government has no power over that teacher. That teacher is paid by a government which is 300 miles away. That's the sense in which decentralization can make a big difference. Of course, there are issues with decentralization also, which will have to be tackled over time. It's not a perfect solution to everything, but we think India needs to go more in that direction because that is where the innovation and creativity, even in governance, will come about.
As you mentioned, India has made considerable strides in terms of making primary education available to all, but you describe how there needs to be a lot more work done in terms of higher education, in terms of maximizing what they do, and that's where you have that example of how you have that interaction between that. The importance of good governance, the importance of government which prioritizes human capital development versus, say, the sort of how that plays that role in terms of making those opportunities available to all Indians or as many Indians as possible.
Absolutely. We should not sort of assume that because India has succeeded in getting every child into school, that child has a good schooling. Unfortunately, what happens is that over time in the schools of lower quality, the child stops learning and then drops out. Our dropout rate is too high for comfort. Similarly, people would be amazed to learn that India graduates 1.5 million engineers a year. That seems like a fantastic population of engineers, but many of them don't have the skills that one would associate with a decent engineering degree because they haven't had the right teachers and they haven't had the right equipment in their colleges. So India is moving and has to move from quantities to quality. Yes, there are fantastic Indian engineers from some of our great institutions like the Indian Institutes of Technology, but we need to multiply that manyfold and that requires a lot of work. And as we said, the temptation for more centralized governments is to focus on handouts, on what are called in India freebies, cash transfers, which can be associated quite immediately with the government. This is not only an Indian problem, it is a problem around the world. But, things like education, which take longer to actually show results, unless, it's very local and you're repainting the schools and ensuring the teachers show up on time. Otherwise, the results take longer to show. And that's why politicians shy away from it. And so what's important is India has to focus on what matters. And that almost surely means making its 1.4 billion people more capable.
Put it this way, that, there's a physical infrastructure required for a country to lay the foundation of its growth, and there's a human capital required to lay the foundation for the country to take off, right? And to a large extent, India has done quite well in the last 10 to 15 years in terms of fixing its physical infrastructure, even fixing its digital infrastructure, which is really is top class right now in India. Streamlining its indirect market through the goods and services tax. So there's lots of good developments that are happening, but actually, and this is at the step of every government almost since independence, India hasn't been able to crack this problem of ensuring a large and steady enough supply of human capital. And we really believe, and that's kind of the way we shape the arguments in the book, that the big binding constraint in India's development path over the next few decades is going to be the quality of its human capital.
And there are lots of experiments in India, some of which we recount in the book. The book is about touching a broad audience, not economists, but giving the examples of what can succeed. So on this issue of human capital, right, how do you make good schools? I mean, many of the venerable schools in India, as elsewhere, have taken many, many decades to come together to have a culture of good teaching and a culture of learning. How do you do that at a mass level in real time? And so we talked to an entrepreneur who started these schools in a very interesting way. What he does is he and his team have prepared something like 30,000 lesson plans, scripting what will be taught in every minute of every class that is taught in the school. And, there are videos shown here. There's a quiz at this point. There's a class discussion at that point for so many minutes. Now, traditional teachers will rebel at this and say, this is too much micromanagement. But the intent here is to make average teachers really good teachers, not great, but good. And so when you have a school full of, lessons being taught at a good level with constant feedback, constant evaluation, what you get is the ability to mass educate at a fairly high level. It's not going to be as great as, Harrow or Eton or the Phillips,
the lab school,
US. There are lots of those fantastic schools, but it will be pretty good. And what this guy is doing is now teaching 300,000 kids. I mean, you can't get those numbers in the small public schools. But if you can teach 300,000 and he's trying to multiply that again by an order of magnitude, you're making a real dent. So lots of interesting experiments. I mean, there have been studies done on what is called scripted learning by some of my colleagues here, including Michael Kramer, a Nobel laureate, and they find that it actually works. It does enhance the quality of schooling significantly. And so these kinds of experiments in India, I think, will be very important, not just for India to succeed, but as a signal to the rest of the world, and maybe a lesson which other countries can explore and imbibe.
We appreciate the time the two of you have taken to speak with us. But before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
Right.
working on a bunch of papers. So, a lot of the time that an academic spends is basically writing research papers. So I'm working on a bunch of interesting research papers on game theory. One of them that I'm excited about currently thinks about what is the difference between hard and soft information and how should economists think about them differently. Raghu and I are also working on a bunch of videos, which has also been very exciting, kind of just informing the general Indian public about the key challenges that the next Indian government, which is going to be sworn in about 6 weeks, is going to face. That's also been very exciting.
Well, the most exciting part of academia is always working on new papers. Unfortunately, old papers also tend to stay with you. So I'm currently working on a revision of an old paper. But also, as you sort of grow older, you tend to write for the wider audience. So I have a request from the IMF to write about its reforms for its 80th anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the IMF. There's a publication they put out. So I'm working on that. And of course, trying to work on broadening the message in this book and reaching it to multiple audiences. Just had an interview with another newspaper this morning. So it's a full life.
Well, those both sound like fascinating projects. I wish you the best of luck with them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Raghu, Rohit, thank you very much for taking some time out of your schedules to speak with us. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks to your listeners.